is a project I've been working with quite closely with Emma Birnbaum at the CEC. She's in Ecology today, unfortunately, so I'll present on her behalf. And this is all work that has been sort of facilitated and sort of made possible by the Wild Otways initiative. So in this case, cameras. I think it's important to note that the Carlisle, we've just been talking about Potoroos a lot, and spoiler alert, we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail in a second, but it's not just Potoroos that live up here. So there are animals like southern brown bandicoots and swamp antechinus, both very threatened species, both of high conservation concern, also occurring in these same areas. And I guess we have to really keep our cautious hats on and not assume that what we're seeing with the Potoroos is exactly the same as what we're going to see with the southern brown bandicoots or the pygmy possums or the antechinus in these areas. In effect, how sensitive a species is to fire is probably going to lie along a continuum rather than just a binary, they're sensitive or they're not. They're negatively impacted or they're not. So we want to look at what happens not just to the Potoroos, but to the mammal community as a whole as well. And so to answer that question, we have to take a different approach. And we've gone down the route of using the remote sensing cameras to do this. One of the great things about their remote sensing cameras is that they're going to detect a range of species, and they're going to help estimate changes in where and how frequently areas are being used before and after fire. So you can see here, this is where our cameras are being deployed. We deploy them before and after fire, and ideally just getting good coverage right across that block. So you can see again, some cameras will be exposed to fire, others not so much. We really want to get a sort of block scale view as to what's going on with the mammal community. And so it's a reasonably straightforward experimental design. Again, we just want to see what happens before and after fire. And what we want to do is we want to have these cameras out for about 4 weeks or so to be confident we can detect, what species are there. And ideally, where equipment allows, we're probably going to repeat this at 6, 12, and 18 months after fire to get a bit more of a longer time scale going on. We are incredibly early in the data analysis process, so I'm not going to be talking about any stats or occupancy modeling or anything like that. That's coming soon, but not right now. But we can start to have a look at some basic exploratory options, things like where we're detecting species and whether or not those detections go up or down. So if we look at Potoroos, which is all I've had time to look at the moment. So if we look at Potoroos at block 4 here, we can see we've got really good detection overall, and we're getting quite high activity up on the ridges. But as that country starts to slope down and move into a different vegetation community, one away from grass trees and more into your messmate and your Garnia and your Lomandris, etc., we're starting to see a real strong decline in Potoroo detections. In fact, most of the cameras in this area didn't detect Potoroos at all. The data is still being collected for this block, the post-fire data. We're still pulling it together. These cameras only came in last week, so I can't speak to changes in this block just yet. But what we can do is we can speak to changes in the other block, block 6 here. So we can see there's some pretty strong activity in the west, and there's some incredible occupancy rates here. We picked up Potoroos at 31 of 32 cameras. So 94% of cameras, it's a block I've never had anything like that happen before. And we can get a bit of a look at, trends in activity. We can see some areas that, while they may have detected Potoroos, they certainly didn't seem to be used quite frequently. So some limited activity in some areas. And what we really want to do here is just look at changes, I guess, in activity as well. So just really quickly, what we want to see is where there's big differences between the yellow circles and the red circles. And there's a couple of points to point out here. Firstly, it's good to see that cameras that were reasonably far away from the burn edge were pretty much detecting similar Potoroo activity. Okay, so that gives us a good idea that, some of the changes we're seeing, might not be due to natural variation. We can also see that where the cameras were within the burn area, activity drops off. In this case, we're not seeing the red circles, okay? They're not being detected after fire. So that's quite intuitive. These burnt areas, certainly not all that suitable for Potoroos. And more broadly, we potentially can see a little bit of a shift in activity at this block towards the west, where we're picking up Potoroos more frequently in more areas on these cameras than we were pre-fire. But of course, we need to back this up with some data. And very quickly, what happens to the predators in this situation as well? That's the great thing about the passive cameras. We can monitor not just one species. So with foxes, we're able to detect them on 2 cameras pre-fire and not a single cat on any of these cameras as well. There is a caveat here that 4 weeks of camera deployments is not all that long to detect these species, but it is what we have to work with. The fire comes in and we pick up foxes at, what is that? That's 6 cameras, okay? So not just 2, 6. And we picked up a cat and an additional camera down here as well. So reasonably strong signal that foxes certainly are using these burn landscapes. And guys, unfortunately, that's about as far as I've gotten with the camera trap data. I'm not just looking at Potoroos. I want to look at what happens with echidnas and bandicoots and antechinus and all of the other species that live here. And hopefully we can get an idea as to how they're being impacted by the fire as well. But it's been a huge haul. It's been about half an hour. I think I'll probably stop there.
Thanks, Mark. It's a spectacular data set. You must have a wonderful team of supervisors behind you, I suspect.
The very best.
Yeah. For those people who don't work very closely with us, that's probably the first time that all of us working on the project have seen all that. So appreciate you doing all the work to get it all done really quickly. It's pretty cool to see it all together. And, you know, it's probably only been possible because of the tenacious attitude of our field team collecting a stack of data. But I've got a couple of questions for you, mate.
Yep.
Andrea's asked, some appear to have larger home ranges than others. Do you know why this is?
Yeah. So I've mucked around with this a little bit, mostly with the data set from last year. What it appears to be is more of a function of body size rather than gender. So it's not quite a straight up boys have big ranges, girls have small ranges sort of story. I think gender does have an important role to play, which we'll probably see come out as we have more data and we can see more individuals. But by and large, yeah. The upper limit of their home ranges, so the ones that are having 20, 23, 28 hectare home ranges, that's also a little bit of a product of animals that seem to sort of put their home range across areas that they also don't use. So like Eugene that we saw, he had a range that was heathy woodland on the left, heathy woodland on the right, and a bit of a gully system in between that he didn't seem to use all that much. So it's sort of maybe overestimating a little bit what his actual home range areas and intensive use areas are. But that's how we end up with some of those, much, much larger ones, larger home ranges.
And just a clarification, there's a question here on how many of the Potoroos survived that weren't exposed to fire.
Yeah. So all of them bar one. So there was one animal, Jen, who was predated upon during that sort of control period. She was an animal that had her home range right up against a road as well. So, not altogether unsurprising. These animals that aren't exposed to fire aren't safe in perpetuity as well. It's why it's important to collect that sort of information.
And that was a total of 6 animals, was it, that were unexposed to fire? Yep, so 1 of 6. A question from Nicole. Have any thoughts on whether or not the intensity of the fire changes the response? So whether or not the vegetation change, I guess, because of the type of fire intensity, reduces the impact?
That's a good question, Nicole. One of the most exciting things about this work going forward is that we're actually planning to have GPS collars attached to cats and foxes in the same area as well. And so I really think that'll help us figure out that question. My gut feeling, at least, is that a fire severity might not matter so much in terms of just facilitating access. I think that's probably what's the issue going on here. So if this fire, regardless of whether or not it's severe or not, opens up areas that foxes and cats may not have used previously, I think that's where the danger is occurring.
I think it's probably important to point out too that the continuity of the fuel in some of these long unburnt places means regardless of the intensity, it carries quite well and it's quite fiery. And you and I have both picked quite spectacular images of burn intensity when in fact there's been a bit of a range too of intensities for the burn blocks. Particularly this year, they were far patchier and I guess less extensive throughout the available Potoroo habitat, I guess would be one way of putting it, Mark. To answer another question here, were each of the fires of similar intensity? Certainly there was a range of fires and intensities, and we intend to sort of measure that as we go a little bit through vegetation analysis.
Totally.
And maybe you and I can commit to maybe not putting up the fireball type responses as images, but they just do look quite spectacular.
It certainly serves a point. Yeah, and as you would have seen on the ground, these grass trees can just flare up like crazy and then die right back off. It's just such a flammable species, so a real challenge.
Most of the other questions might were around that fire intensity question, so I think we've covered that. And in effect,
it's a question that we're interested in asking as well, and one we won't really be able to answer until we have that predator side of the equation.
That's right. And probably good to point out too, whilst this is the first year of the Wild Otways initiative, we weren't in a position to do the predator control this year as part of the experiment. We will next year. So that hasn't been conducted yet. And we probably, throw out a sort of another thanks to FFMV, who've been so wonderful and adaptable in the way that they've done fire in order for us to get this research up and off the ground. With that, I think we'll move on. You're done, old boy. Thanks for your contribution. Next up,